Now, as a result, as I said, more young people are saying that they have no religious affiliation at all. They're called the nones. You've probably heard about the nuns, right? Not that kind of nun, N-O-N-E-S. When asked what your religious affiliation is, you check none, okay? Time magazine called the nones one of the 10 ideas that's going to change our lives in the coming years. And part of that is because we know that what your religious identification is when you are a teenager is very likely to be your religious identification well into adulthood. Nuns, a few facts about nuns. Nuns are the fastest growing religious group in America. About 1 in 4 in the Northeast where I live, it's 1 in 3. It grows fastest among young adults. 1 in 3 young adults, or about half in the Northeast, 18 to 26-year-olds, say that they have no religion in particular. And again, because we know that religiosity tends to be stable as you get older or you become less religious, one of those two things happens, this has massive implications for the religiosity of the American culture generally as we move forward. More young adults self-identify as nuns than as mainline Protestants or evangelical Christians. Most nuns were raised in religious homes. 2/3 were raised in Christian homes. In other words, these are not somebody else's kids. These are our kids. And if we're honest, they're our children. These are people who've come to youth group. These are people who we love, that we've tried to pass on faith with, but what they have not been able to wrap their minds around is seeing their lives from God's side of the clock. And this last one is important. Most nuns are not atheists or agnostics. They still do religious things. For example, they still meet at sacred spaces, okay? Remember this? I'm not kidding. This is where they go on Sunday mornings, okay? They engage in prophetic witness. See if you remember this, okay? They have sacred rituals and sacred communities and pilgrimages. These are pictures from Burning Man. Do you know what Burning Man is? It's like an arts festival in the desert. And people go and they do these weird art installations and performance art and so on. And then they leave the desert exactly as they found it again. It's like a pilgrimage site for young adults. I want to be clear. I don't see the movement towards young adults self-identifying as nuns as being this mass act of apostasy. I see it as a bunch of young adults trying to be honest. Okay, I'm pretty sure we've had nuns in our pews and in our families for a long time. It's just that at the moment that you don't get as many social points for just showing up at church, so why pretend? A lot of young people grew up in church. They don't hate religious people. A lot of them, if you ask them, will say, yeah, I wish I could have this faith. I wish I could buy into this. I just honestly don't. So I think this is our mission field as a church for the 21st century. For us to stop preaching to the choir and to become a credible public witness to people who self-identify as nuns. As you know, 4 years ago, the Council of Bishops approved a plan to lower the average age of the United Methodist Church by 10 years by 2019. Now, the reports I've read, maybe you've read different ones, say that we're down to, I think the average age where we started was 57, now we're down to maybe 55, but our target is 47, and we're nowhere near that at this point. We're going to talk more about this afternoon, but for now, I want to look at what really are we saying when we say we want to be a younger church. Because we've got a couple of myths that are tripping us up, that we are enacting on a weekly basis in an effort to try to become relevant to these nuns, these moralistic therapeutic deists that we have in our midst. So I want to end this morning by just taking 2 of these myths kind of off the table, all right? So this is where we'll stop the conversation this morning. Okay, myth number 1. This myth is that young people will save the church, okay? Now, let's get the theology out of the way right now, all right? Because young people are not going to save the church. Only Jesus Christ saves the church. Got it? So let's just say that. But we fall into this rhetorical pattern, and we hear this all the time. We hear it from our congregations. We hear it from our denominational leaders. You probably said it yourself at some point. If our church is going to survive, we need more young people. you know? Our church is dying, so we need young people to save us. And when we see youth as salvation of our dying congregations, what we're really doing is using young people for our own ends, not seeing them as people called into God's service in their own right. We engage in what I call vampire theology, okay? Now, what vampire theology is that we see some young people coming through the door, and what we see is young blood the church needs to survive, right? And then what do? We proceed to suck the life right out of them. And we do that for our own survival. This is flat out an anxiety reaction. We know that when we are honest or anxious, human beings' brains don't work right, okay? We're not as efficient when we are under stress. We revert to survival thinking, which means we can't think about other people. We can only think about protecting our own. Because at some primal level, we feel threatened, we feel scared, we're afraid we're gonna die. Does that sound like something your church has said? Because here's the really interesting part. It's not just individuals that have anxiety reactions. Institutions, communities, cultures do too. Murray Bowen's classic theory of anxiety has been used to study millennial young people, but I think you could just as easily use it to describe the church. In a state of heightened anxiety, Bowen says, we can't access our whole brains, so we start thinking from the reptilian part of our brain back here. And that makes us do one of four things: fight, flight, right? Freeze, or protect. Okay? Which means that anxious churches are thinking with the reptilian brain. We are thinking like lizards, okay? And when survival instincts take over, we lose the ability to think about others. We lose the ability to reflect critically, because that takes time we don't have. We lose our sense of humor because we're desperate. We can't take a joke. We can't perceive nuance or paradox. Does this sound like a church that you've been in lately? Our survival instincts, fight, flight, freeze, protect, go into overdrive. So here's a time with your partner, a couple of minutes, just identify it. Do you see in your congregation anxiety reactions? Go. One more minute. All right, back together again. You know, we tend to blame young people for leaving the church. We tend to blame them for leaving our social institutions, but the research tells us that social institutions abandon young people faster than they abandon us. That's especially true once you hit young adulthood, because most of our culture's institutions are done with young people by the time they hit their 20s. If you think about it, your school graduates you. Your family backs off a little, right? You age out of things like sports and orchestra and other kinds of community activities that you've been part of. And so the decade of your life, the 20s, where you are arguably making the most life-shaping decisions you will ever make about who your life partner will be, about what your governing ideology is going to be, your worldview, about what kind of work you're going to do. You make those decisions either on your own or with a group of friends who are as clueless as you are, okay? Because you don't have these institutions with multiple ages there to help, you bear the wisdom of traditions or your elders. So this is myth number one, thinking that young people will save the church. This isn't likely in a culture of anxiety, which is why Jesus Christ came to save us from ourselves. Myth number two, making the church appeal to young people means you have to act like one, okay? This is a myth. Have you ever been to a church that's trying to become younger by acting the way they think young people will act? It's a little like a middle-aged guy who thinks he's going to just seem younger if he grows some stubble and wears skinny jeans, So, what's the first thing? If we want young people in our church, what is the first thing we think we need to have? I hear it. A praise band. Yeah. Now, I will say this, and then I will have at least half of the room mad at me for saying this, and I will escape before you can tackle me after this. Just so you know, and maybe it's not true in Texas, but everywhere else it's true. Millennial young people are not, they don't like praise music. Baby boomers like praise music. Yeah, that was the under 35 people again. Now, look. What they like is good music. So, that's part of it. And we are really bad at it. But the research tells us that young people see praise music as cheesy, and the main thing you don't want to be is inauthentic if you're young. So do what you do it well, and plus they like being attached to a tradition. That is a whole different speech. We can talk about that another year. But right now, it's very trendy to blame shallow Christianity on youth ministry. And it's what Tom Bergler and others call the juvenilization of the American church. And it's the perception that immature faith somehow started in youth ministry and then spread like pink eye through the rest of the congregation, right? Now, you've just heard a bunch of research that contradicts this. Young people learn shallow faith from us, not the other way around. So let's take responsibility here. Usually what this means is this winds up being some kind of a critique of worship. But I think personally it's dangerous to levy a critique of worship against any one style of worship. From what I can see, there's enough bad worship going around that everybody gets a share of it, okay? But it's an insult to teenagers to associate immaturity with characteristics and qualities that teenagers hold dear and lift up for our culture, like idealism and friendship and emotionalism and embodiment. These are human traits, not adolescent ones. Marketers know that you don't win teenagers by treating them like teenagers. You win teenagers by treating them like people. Fastest growing denominations in terms of young people. You know what they are? Pentecostals and the Eastern Orthodox. It's not because of their contemporary worship service, okay? What they have in common, what these religious communities have in common is they are high expectation cultures. They have high expectations of participation. They have high expectations of embodiment. They're sensual. These are not adolescent traits. They are human traits. And whenever we say to young people, as Chris Coble puts it, we invite you to be a member of our club, and we'll even give you a reduced rate. What we're really saying to them is, hey, you know what? Christianity is cheap.